Greetings. I'm Brad Miner. I'm senior editor of The Catholic Thing. If you don't know us, we are a column series delivered to our readers every morning at 6 a.m. Eastern Time, each column about 1,000 words in length. And you can sign up to receive those emails for free. And we are commenting on everything that has to do with Catholicism in the United States and around the world. And today I have the privilege of interviewing my friend, my colleague, and the editor-in-chief of The Catholic Thing, Robert Royal, about his new book, Martyrs of the New Millennium, which has the subtitle, Global Persecution of Christians in the 21st Century. And I should add at the start that the book has behind it the assistance of a wonderful organization called Aid to the Church in Need USA, of which I was once a board member. And Bob, let me jump right in. This book is about martyrdom, obviously. And many of us thought that after the end of the World War II, and especially after the fall of communism, that perhaps we'd seen the last of the deaths of people like Edith Stein and Maximilian Kolbe. But it's turned out that that's not the case. But before we get into the various places where Catholics and other Christians are being martyred, let's talk about what martyrdom is, because it's not maybe exactly what everyone thinks it is.
Yeah, Brad, thanks for asking that question. And isn't this nice to have the two of us doing a podcast together? We never get a chance to do this. And two friends talking with one another about a book. It's terrific. Yeah, I made a point in the introduction to this book of trying to explain how recent times have actually forced something of a, I think, more precise definition, not a redefinition, but a more precise definition of what a martyr is. Because, look, lots of people claim to be martyrs, right? I mean, there are Islamic suicide bombers who are allegedly martyrs for the international caliphate that they hope to create. And there were martyrs for communism and even martyrs for horrible things like Nazism and fascism. But the church has always talked about people dying in odium fidei, in the hatred of the faith. That's historically the phrase that is used about what a martyr is. And in a lot of instances, we can see it like in the early Roman Empire days where, and we ought to understand this, it isn't so much a theological clash, although there are pagan elements competing with Christian elements. But it is a kind of a hatred toward the faith because of what it represents. And in the Roman Empire, it represented an alternative source of morals, of orientations of people's lives, of loyalties, that the Romans were very nervous about. They always like to preserve the monopoly of power. And so you see that played out through history, obviously in the Soviet Union, Christian bodies and in Warsaw Pact were a thorn in the side of regimes. And that's sort of the older understanding. But John Paul II came up with a second category. He called them the nuovi martiri, the new martyrs, who are people who are placed in certain circumstances and they stay there anyway. It surprises a lot of people. Like, for example, the most dangerous country to be a Catholic priest in these days is Mexico. And not because of an anti-Christian government, although there is an element of anti-Christianity in their government, but because of the cartels, the drug traffickers, the human traffickers, etc. And where priests stand in the way of those criminal organizations, they very often get run over. Pope Francis came up with a third category, and he called it oblatio vitae, the offering of your life, which is usually spontaneous and the spur of the moment. The example I like to quote is one Amir Bakash, who was a Catholic in Pakistan, in Lahore, Pakistan, who on Laetare Sunday in 2015 was kind of a casual, bodyguard, security officer outside of a church, and somebody, a Muslim martyr, a Muslim suicide bomber, tried to enter the church to kill what would have been probably over 1,000 people. He grabbed the person and said, "I will die, but you will not enter." So this isn't a person who habitually was out there in danger, but at the spur of the moment, and this is what Francis wanted to say, the offering of your life, of a person who's a good person, and has a reputation as being a good Catholic in his community. So I think it's worth making these distinctions, because otherwise we won't entirely understand what it means to be a martyr in our time, and maybe even to a certain extent in the past.
And it's not new to the 21st century. It wasn't new to the 20th when you wrote your first book about martyrdom. In fact, Jesus spoke about it, didn't he?
Yeah, that's a thing that I'm glad you brought up, because a lot of people think somehow that if Christians are being persecuted or being opposed or being killed, it's our fault. Well, Jesus says, they hate me and they will hate you. They will persecute you from one place to another. And he doesn't just mean in his time. He says they will, in the future, this thing will go forward. Because Christianity, we're used to it in our still somewhat Christian, post-Christian societies. Christianity seems to us to be, at least in some respects, a kind of normal background to our culture. Human dignity, for example, is something that doesn't exist in every culture, but it does exist where Christianity and Judaism have put forth the idea that we're made in the image and likeness of God. But that doesn't cover the waterfront at all. And when you can still see the prolongation of the old totalitarian oppression in places like China, for example, or North Korea. North Korea has got some horrifying stories that we probably won't learn about until that regime falls. But you also see it in places like the Middle East, Africa, where you have a Islamic militant movement that's trying to establish a worldwide Islamism. We even see it in Europe, where there are multiple stabbings, shootings, truck attacks on a regular basis. So it's very much still with us. And to think that somehow, if we're true Christians and we're manifesting love, we are not going to be persecuted or opposed, sometimes killed, it's a very naive, and I think it's a false perspective if you take as your true perspective the Gospels.
And in the Middle East, we've seen a great deal of Islamic violence against Christians. Certainly at Aid to the Church in Need, when I was on the board, a lot of what we were doing was trying to provide aid to people who were fleeing from Al-Qaeda. The Al-Qaeda version of Islam isn't the whole version of Islam. It's not necessarily the true version of Islam. But Pope Francis seemed to favor outreach to Muslims, as he also made outreach to the Chinese Communist Party. Do you think that's the right approach? And if you were going to advise Leo XIV, what would you suggest?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I mean, obviously, the Chinese arrangement is not working. It's working for the Chinese. It's not working for the church. The motivation behind that was a good one, that they didn't want to have the church divided in China, where you had an underground church and an official church. But when you're dealing with totalitarians, there's almost no way other than being back in the catacombs to protect yourself. And we don't know what is in that agreement that was signed in 2018 with the Chinese. We still call it the secret accord because it hasn't been revealed. But all we can say is that we thought that what we were getting is that there would be a kind of a mutual process by which new bishops would be appointed, decisions would be made of kind of an administrative nature. But that's not how the Chinese see it. During the interregnum, in the period between the death of Francis and the election of Leo, the Chinese Communist Party appointed 2 bishops in the absence of a bishop of Rome. And prior to that, when we still had Pope Francis, they had actually created a new diocese. They decided to consolidate certain things and create a new diocese. Now, we know that 10 bishops, right as we are speaking right now, are missing. We don't know what happened to them. They disappeared. We can speculate that the government picked them up and they're being either held somewhere or they're dead. But none of this bodes well for what this agreement is. So if Leo wants to take this one on, he almost has to repudiate, and that itself can carry some perils for Christians in China. But look, they're in peril anyway, and so I think he's going to have to take some strong measures. As to reaching out to Islam, you're right to say that militant Islam, that Islamism, militant radical extremist Islamism isn't the only understanding of Islam. But Islam is I wouldn't even say evangelizing religion. Christianity spread by evangelization, by convincing people privately. Islam spread by the sword. I mean, it conquered the Middle East and it conquered North Africa, almost conquered all of Spain and started to move into France and was stopped militarily. And some of that still exists inside Islam. Now, maybe we hope that there are reform movements possible. When we talk about evangelizing the world, we don't mean necessarily, aggressively invading places to evangelize, but that's pretty much what militant Islam did and why it destroyed a large part of the Christian community in the Middle East and why aid to the church in need when you were working with them. And even now, it's not only seeking to protect and to raise the visibility of what's happening to Christians there, but also trying to rebuild so that they can return. These are really hard questions, but the way we tackle them is we first of all have to know about them. And that's one of the reasons why Aid to the Church in Need asked me to write this book and why, even though I had some other things to do, I decided it was worth doing.
And moving out of Islam and into one particular nation, India. When I was young, I was admitted to the Peace Corps. The program that I was going to be serving on was to be in India. And the program got canceled because there was a cholera outbreak, and that's a good reason to cancel a program, I guess. But I always thought of India, and that's the way it was presented to me in the 1970s, as a multicultural nation that was very tolerant of diverse religions and people. That seems to be changing. So there's martyrdom for purely religious reasons is coming into conflict, into collision with nationalism. And I wonder about that, about the distinction with regard to martyrdom of people who are asserting nationalism against what they consider to be a foreign ideology.
Yeah. No, you're right to put your finger on India, which is really a special case because we can see how Islamic radicalism jumped to Africa. It's now present in Pakistan. It's present out in Far East Asia. But India is an interesting case because the ruling party is a Hindu party. It's an explicitly Hindu party. And as anybody knows who's knocked around studying world religions, Hinduism isn't particularly an aggressive and not even an evangelizing faith. It's kind of a more contemplative, almost just a kind of a cultural existence, in India and some other places. But the current government in India has decided to use a kind of a hardline Hinduism, and not only as a kind of a nationalism, as a kind of, I think, anti-Western ideology. I mean, India is I think it's the biggest country in terms of population. And it's growing and wants to be influential. It's got a very strong military. And I think one part of that, of growth of self-identity is being expressed through some very bad encouraging of anti-Christian activity on the part of governments. Now, when it does happen, the government will kind of respond in a pro forma way. But it's very clear that in certain places, this is a policy that is being used to squeeze out as much Christian influence as possible and to make what they call Hindutva, which is a kind of an ideology of Hinduism that's partly political, to make that the governing framework of everything in the country. So it's an interesting case in India, and I hope we don't see it reproduced in other countries.
Well, and swinging back across the ocean and into Latin America, we have a situation going on in a number of countries there, most specifically in Nicaragua, where it's not even nationalism, it's a one family state that sees the Catholic Church as standing in its way, the Ortega regime in Nicaragua. And I'm wondering, so far, I haven't heard so much about people being martyred for the faith there, although I think that has happened. But they're certainly trying to bleed out as many Catholic clerics as they possibly can.
Yeah, there's been a shift since the 20th century in the sense that most governments now recognize that to create martyrs is to create problems for yourselves. So the Chinese, who are clearly, I think, murdering people and killing bishops, and if not killing them directly, putting them in conditions in prisons where a lot of these are elderly men and they don't survive. But in Nicaragua in particular, they like Cuba, they have to be careful about what they do because, first of all, they're close to the United States. And there's no telling what the United States might do if they really were to have very, very open, they have open repression of almost all activities of the Catholic Church, but there's going to be a point probably where people are going to object. There's a joke, I tell it in the book, you probably saw it there, that it used to be in Latin America that people would worry about who will be the next Cuba. And now they say, who will be the next Nicaragua? It's gotten that bad. Now, Nicaragua, it goes, remember, I'm sure a lot of people who are listening or watching us today remember when John Paul II was in Nicaragua back in the early 80s. And back then, the Sandinistas and the Ortegas, who were then even running the show down there back then among the radicals, they set up an alternative sound system during his mass, and they were shouting, basically communist and Marxist slogans and whatnot. And John Paul stood up and said, "Silencio!" Remember, there was this famous incident when he had to do that. Well, they were the same people who are back. It's Daniel Ortega and his wife and their kids, and people used to joke about in Romania that it was socialism within one family rather than within one country, and that's pretty much what we have in Nicaragua now. But it's not only there; it's Venezuela. It's also in Cuba still, although again, it's toned down the way that they're doing it. I mentioned the problems in Mexico. It'll be interesting because Pope Leo has a long history in Latin America. He speaks perfect Spanish. I've been listening to it. It's a very elegant Spanish. His Italian is very elegant. And so he knows that part of the world, and no doubt he will have some interesting ideas about how to do it. Clearly, Pope Francis didn't want to have to confront a place like Nicaragua. There were negotiations, but I think we're probably likely to get a different approach under Pope Leo XIV.
Now, I want to swing now to the United States, and I want to read a section from your book, The Martyrs of the New Millennium. You write, "Christianity is especially vulnerable because since the Enlightenment, the modernist, postmodernist paradigm is basically oriented toward replacing Christianity's cultural and social dominance, and not, incidentally, along with it, the Jewish tradition from which Christianity emerged." So does this suggest that nominal Christians and Jews had better begin to worry about what we're talking about today?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The last chapter in my book, I'm very proud of because there are a lot of books about martyrdom in the modern world or, specific countries. I think mine is the only one now that is the kind of global look in the 21st century. But my last chapter is about persecution and martyrdom in the West, because I think we think we're immune from this. And in fact, we're not. Our left-wingism in the United States is not anywhere near like what we saw in the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact countries or China today. But it's got its own way of working through our, what we think are our democratic systems to repress Christians, little sisters of the poor, all the stuff that we've been encountering. In Europe, there are very direct threats. There's a wonderful organization in Vienna that I've been in contact with over the last couple of years called the Observatory on Anti-Christian Acts and Repression or something like that. In any event, they use the European Union's own criteria for hate crimes each year, and they put out a yearly report. And you'd be surprised. We hear about as I said earlier, these knife attacks and truck attacks and There's the famous case of Father Jacques Hamel, who had his throat cut in France by two young Islamists. There is something on the order, I think the last 2 years, it's been 800 and over 800 different anti-Christian hate crimes. Again, as defined by the EU criteria, 700 to 800 anti-Christian hate crimes in the European Union. You have the same thing going on in England. I mean, we hear these terrible stories about knife attacks, and more worrisome to me, though, because I think those things are direct and they could be dealt with by forces of law and order if there was a will to do it. More worrisome to me is the way that people praying outside of an abortion clinic, quietly and apart from the abortion clinic, or people who are perceived to have insulted Islam, are being arrested. They're being taken into jail. They're being fined. They're going into courts. Now, we haven't gotten that far yet here in the United States, but when England, jolly old England is going down that path, we need to worry. Our bishops have done a study, I think it went from 2020 to 2024, about anti-Catholic acts, arsons, various things, beheading statues, all that kind of thing. There were over 400 in those 4 years. In other words, 100 a year, even here in the United States. And I like to point to the case in Canada. A lot of people are probably aware of what happened when it was reported that there were these mass graves outside of government schools that had been run by the church. And this is going back like 100 years. And something like 30 churches were burned in Canada. By the way, in France, there are 2 churches burned every month. So take that in as well. But 30 churches were burned in Canada. And the Holy Father at the time, Pope Francis, went to Canada and apologized for this. Because, of course, Christians are evil and they must have done something wrong 100 years ago. And in fact, there are no mass graves. The Canadian government spent, I think, $10 million looking for those graves and found none. And so we had this anti-Christian hysteria in a place like Canada. This is, mild, easygoing Canada. So, look, anybody who's hearing this and lives in the West, don't think you're excluded from what is happening in the world. It's not as if anti-Christianity stops somewhere, where European culture has been dominant. It's everywhere. We need to be vigilant about it. We need to respond to it. We need to protect ourselves.
It reminds me, too, of the famous statement by our good friend, Cardinal George, the late Cardinal George of Chicago, that he expected to die in his bed. He expected his successor to end up in prison and expected that man's successor to be martyred. The idea that it can't happen in the United States is wrong, because we may have a moment right now when we don't feel particularly threatened by that kind of anti-Christian action of law. And there have been people, pro-life activists, who've been arrested by the FBI, had their homes broken into for doing nothing more than protesting. But can it happen here, do you think? And how do we really avoid it?
Yeah. Look, we can hope and pray and work so that it doesn't happen. I think it's a hopeful sign that there seems to be a return to religion, and specifically Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, especially among men in the United States. I think also that's the case in England and in France. They had large numbers of conversions. Vocations haven't quite caught up with this wave of returning religiosity. And, we keep hoping that the sheer desperateness of the materialist society that we live in will drive people back to the more meaningful foundations that they find in Christianity and Judaism and, maybe some other religions as well. But who knows? I mean, it's been a long time that we've been on this kind of materialistic, nihilistic train. And just now, we have a government that at least protects Christians, is intent on making sure that Christians aren't discriminated against. But the way to make sure it doesn't happen is to remain ever vigilant. That's all I can say. And to take steps wherever we can. The people who are anti-Christians know how to use our legal system, our political system against us. We need to be wiser and more energetic than they are wherever we can possibly be active.
Well, from your mouth to God's ear, Bob. That's all the time we have right now for this discussion. I'll remind you again that we are the Catholic Thing at thecatholicthing.org. We like to say that each of our columns can be read each morning with just one cup of coffee, or in my case, a cup of water. Bob, it's been great.
Well, thank you, Brad. This has been good, not just the fact that it's the two of us, but it's good to have somebody who knows a bit about these things and can ask the right questions, because we need to get moving on this, and we need to get moving on it fast. So thanks.
Thank you.